He was a billionaire who could buy anything except a hug from his own son. Until one woman changed everything. The breakfast rush had just passed at Maggie's diner, and sunlight streamed through the dusty windows, pooling over the faded checkered floors and worn leather booths. The scent of coffee, fresh biscuits, and sizzling bacon lingered in the air, wrapping the small restaurant in a blanket of comfort only found in places untouched by time. Maggie's wasn't fancy. It wasn't trendy. But it was familiar. And sometimes, familiarity was its own kind of treasure. In a booth by the window, where Sheriff Coleman usually worked his crossword puzzles, sat someone entirely unexpected, Ethan Wallace. 60 years old, silver at his temples, Ethan wasn't the sort you'd expect to find tucked into a diner corner. A man who had built an empire in mining contracts and logistics, he usually inhabited spaces filled with glass walls and polished steel. His starched white shirt and neatly pressed slacks looked out of place against the diner's rustic charm. Across from him, nearly swallowed by the large booth, sat a boy no more than 6 years old. Caleb Wallace. The boy's mop of blonde curls looked like it hadn't seen a comb that morning. His small arms were locked tightly around himself, and his wide, anxious eyes were fixed on the table. Every loud laugh or clatter of dishes made him flinch sharply, as if expecting some unseen blow. A plate of untouched blueberry muffins sat in front of him, ignored. Caleb wasn't like other children his age. Diagnosed with severe anxiety disorder and a developmental emotional delay, he struggled to connect with the world around him. He avoided eye contact, didn't like to be touched, and in his 6 short years had never not once hugged his own father. Across the diner, Sophie Bennett watched it all unfold. She had just finished refilling a table's coffee when she noticed the small, tense figure by the window. Sophie, bright-eyed at 32, carried herself with a soft, unhurried energy. Before working at Maggie's, she had trained as a pediatric nurse. Life had thrown her a few curveballs, and she found herself here instead, but her heart for children, especially the fragile ones, had never dimmed. She didn't rush over. She didn't crouch down and speak in syrupy tones. Instead, she approached quietly, offering a gentle presence instead of overwhelming attention. Meeting Ethan's guarded gaze, she gave a soft, understanding nod before turning her attention to Caleb. Her voice, when she spoke, was barely above a whisper. "Can I get you something else, sweetie? Maybe some warm milk?" Caleb didn't answer, but he looked up. Just for a second. To Sophie, that brief glance was everything. The moment fractured when a plate crashed in the kitchen ceramic against tile, sharp and sudden. Caleb jolted as though struck. His breathing quickened, shallow and ragged. He pressed his small hands against his ears and began rocking slightly, retreating into himself as the noise of the world overwhelmed him. Ethan froze, halfway reaching out across the table, but paralyzed by uncertainty. His mouth opened to comfort his son, but the words fumbled and failed. "Caleb," he said, voice thick with helplessness. "It's okay. It's just a plate." But Caleb wasn't hearing him. Forks hovered mid-air. Conversations halted. The diner held its breath, and then Sophie moved. She didn't lunge or panic. She didn't speak. She simply stepped a few feet closer, knelt down at a respectful distance, and opened her arms wide, calm, palms up. An offering, an invitation, nothing more. Caleb stared at her through tear-blurred eyes, his chest heaving. Seconds stretched long and thin. Then, without a word, without warning, he slid out of the booth, shuffled toward her, and folded himself into her arms. A collective exhale rippled through the diner. Ethan remained frozen, hands still extended mid-air, stunned. 6 years of specialists, therapists, behavioral charts, all without a single hug. And now, his son clung to a stranger, like a drowning child finding the shore. Sophie held him without squeezing, without rocking, just steady and sure. She let Caleb set the pace, simply offering her presence as an anchor in his storm. Tears pricked at Ethan's eyes, sharp and unfamiliar. He lowered his hand slowly, pressing it against his chest as if to steady his own racing heart. It wasn't just the hug itself that mattered. It was what it represented. It was trust. It was hope. It was the first fragile thread connecting Caleb to a world that, until that moment, had been too loud, too sharp, too unsafe. When Caleb finally pulled back, Sophie smiled at him. A real smile, one that didn't ask for anything in return. She stood, ruffling his hair lightly if he allowed, and made no comment to break the spell. Instead, she simply asked, "Would you like that warm milk now, sweetheart?" Caleb gave the smallest nod, and just like that, the world shifted, not dramatically. Not with fireworks or grand announcements, but quietly, softly. In the kind of way that sticks with you forever. Ethan watched his son slide back into the booth, more relaxed than he'd seen him in months, maybe years. Sophie moved behind the counter again, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But it had. Everything had changed. And though Ethan Wallace didn't yet know the shape that change would take, he knew deep in his bones that he had just witnessed the beginning of something rare, something precious. A small miracle born from nothing more than open arms and the willingness to wait. And in that sunlight-soaked diner, for the first time in a very long while, Ethan Wallace allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, healing was possible. Maybe, just maybe, they wouldn't have to walk through life alone. The next morning, the sun once again rose over Santa Fe, casting long slants of gold through the windows of Maggie's diner. But something was different, something only the most perceptive could feel. It was as if the air itself held a lingering tenderness, a reminder that something small but miraculous had happened there the day before. Ethan Wallace sat alone in his car across the street, staring at the diner's faded sign. His hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles pale. He had never been a man to linger. Meetings, deals, appointments. His life had always been a series of tasks to be completed, goals to be conquered, but today he hesitated. Inside the diner, Sophie Bennett was wiping down the counter with practiced ease. Her movements were simple, methodical, but her heart still carried the weight of yesterday. She hadn't gone home thinking she'd done something extraordinary. For Sophie, offering comfort was second nature. Yet she couldn't deny the way her own chest had tightened when Caleb had folded himself into her arms. Finally, Ethan stepped out of his car, smoothing his shirt nervously, something he hadn't done since his first investor pitch decades ago. He walked into the diner, his usual presence, the aura of someone used to being obeyed, noticeably muted. There was no entourage today, no assistant shuffling papers or checking his watch. Just Ethan. A father. A man, carrying something heavy he didn't know how to set down. He waited until the breakfast rush had thinned, until the noise was low and the booths mostly empty. Only then did he approach the counter where Sophie was stacking menus. "Excuse me," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. Sophie looked up, her expression open but cautious. Ethan paused, gripping the brim of his hat awkwardly in his hands. "I wanted to thank you." Sophie tilted her head slightly, a gentle smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "For what you did yesterday." She wiped her hands on her apron and nodded once, not dismissively, but in understanding. "He's a sweet boy," she said simply. Ethan swallowed hard. "He's not like other children," he said. "Doctors, therapists." He shook his head. "He won't sit beside them. He screams when they try to check his heartbeat." Sophie said nothing, sensing he wasn't finished. "But yesterday," Ethan continued, his voice cracking, "he walked across a room, and he hugged you." He said it like it was the rarest thing in the world, and for him it was. Sophie didn't rush to fill the silence. She simply nodded again, her eyes kind. "Sometimes," she said softly, "kids just know when someone isn't trying to fix them." Ethan's hands tightened on his hat. That truth hit him harder than any business negotiation or boardroom betrayal. All his life, he had believed that problems were meant to be solved aggressively, strategically, efficiently. But maybe his son wasn't a problem. Maybe Caleb was simply a boy who needed someone willing to meet him where he was, not where the world expected him to be. From inside his jacket, Ethan pulled out a small embossed business card. He placed it carefully on the counter between them. "I don't know what you do outside of this place," he said, "but I'd like to offer you something." Sophie glanced down at the card, but didn't reach for it. "Not a job," Ethan added quickly, as if afraid she might misunderstand. "Just time. With him, play a game, read a book. Sit in the sun, whatever feels right." Sophie's hand hovered over the card, then withdrew. She wasn't thinking about money. She was thinking about the boy's breath slowing against her shoulder, the way he had trusted her without words. "I'll think about it," she said, her voice warm but non-committal. Ethan exhaled, a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He nodded and turned to leave, but then paused, almost awkwardly. "One more thing," he said. From his other pocket, he pulled a small, folded piece of paper, crumpled edges worn from being gripped too tightly by small hands. He handed it to her. Sophie unfolded it carefully. Inside, drawn in thick crayon strokes, were two stick figures with their arms stretched wide and a wobbly red heart between them. It wasn't much. It was everything. Sophie stared at it for a long moment, her throat tightening unexpectedly. Some invitations don't come in envelopes, some don't use words, some come in the form of a child's drawing, born from a place deeper than language. Sophie looked up, her voice barely above a whisper. "Tell him I'd love to come by, just for a little while." Ethan nodded, and this time there was something different in his eyes. Not just gratitude, hope, real, fragile hope. As he walked out of Maggie's diner and into the bright Santa Fe morning, Ethan Wallace felt something unfamiliar settle inside him. A quiet belief that maybe, just maybe, this world still held spaces where love didn't have to be earned, where connection wasn't transactional, and where the smallest gestures could rebuild the parts of us we thought were lost forever. And all of it, every aching, beautiful possibility, had begun with a single, ordinary hug. After leaving the diner that morning, Ethan Wallace found himself standing outside his home office, staring at the heavy oak door like it held some great mystery. He had made a career out of walking into rooms filled with tension, brokering deals worth millions without blinking. But now, asking someone to help his Sonasking for something personal felt like the most daunting task of his life. Sophie Bennett had said she would think about it. Ethan replayed her words in his mind over and over, wondering if he'd been too forward, too presumptive. He wasn't used to uncertainty. In his world, contracts were signed, terms were negotiated, and expectations were clear. But this was different. Meanwhile, Sophie folded the small crayon drawing and tucked it carefully into her apron pocket. She finished her shift at Maggie's diner. The memory of Caleb's tiny arms wrapped around her still fresh in her mind. She wasn't naive. She knew that stepping into the life of a billionaire's son wouldn't be simple. But the drawing, that shaky heart between two stick figures, had touched something deep inside her. 2 days later, Ethan returned to the diner, not with contracts or formalities, but with something far more vulnerable: hope. He sat at the counter, nervous, sipping coffee he barely tasted. When Sophie approached, he stood, feeling awkward. "Miss Bennett," he began, clearing his throat. "I just wanted to, if you're still considering, to let you know there are no expectations." Sophie smiled, easing his tension a bit. "I'd like to try," she said simply. Ethan exhaled, the relief evident on his face. He handed her a simple card with an address and a time. "Tomorrow. Just for an hour or two. If it's too much, we'll stop." The next afternoon, Sophie arrived at the Wallace Estatia, sprawling, meticulously kept property that felt more like a fortress than a home. The gates opened at her arrival, and she drove up the winding path with steady hands, reminding herself why she was here. A butler greeted her, polite but formal, and led her to the sunroom. The space was beautiful glass walls, warm sunlight, and comfortable furniture arranged thoughtfully. In the corner sat Caleb, a box of crayons at his feet, absently scribbling on a blank page. Ethan lingered near the doorway, uncertain whether to stay or leave. Sophie knelt nearby, keeping a respectful distance. "Hi, Caleb," she said gently. "It's nice to see you again." The boy didn't look up, but he stilled, listening. Sophie reached into her tote bag and pulled out a small picture book and a few sheets of fresh paper. She didn't push. She didn't coax. She simply laid the items out like an offering and waited. Minutes passed long, stretching minutes before Caleb slid a crayon across the floor toward her. A silent invitation. Sophie picked it up, smiling softly. "Green," she said. "My favorite color." She began to draw lopsided turtle with an enormous shell. Nothing fancy, nothing overwhelming, just lines and colors and silly smiles. Slowly, Caleb edged closer. Ethan watched, heart pounding, as his son engaged in the smallest of gestures, offering a crayon, inching forward, watching Sophie with cautious curiosity. For the next hour, Sophie and Caleb colored side by side, occasionally exchanging glances, occasionally sharing shy smiles. No therapy jargon, no behavior charts, just presence. When Sophie finally stood to leave, Caleb did something Ethan hadn't seen before. He tugged at the hem of her shirt, eyes wide but unafraid. "Come again?" he whispered. Sophie knelt to his level, her voice warm. "I'd love to, Caleb." That night, Ethan sat alone in his study, the house unusually quiet. He stared at the crayon drawing Caleb had thrust into his hand after Sophie left. Simple scene of a smiling stick figure beside a lopsided turtle. It wasn't just a drawing. It was a bridge. And for the first time in years, Ethan Wallace realized that maybe he didn't have to build that bridge alone. The first few visits were quiet. Sophie Bennett, arrived at the Wallace estate on time, every time, a well-worn tote bag slung over her shoulder. Inside were simple treasures, picture books, coloring pages, a battered set of colored pencils, and a handful of small toys with no blinking lights or overwhelming noises. Nothing loud, nothing demanding. Each time she entered the sunroom where Caleb waited, she kept her movements slow and her voice soft, never assuming, never pushing. She let Caleb lead, even if leading meant silence. Sometimes, Caleb barely acknowledged her, staying curled up near the window, absorbed in his own private world. Sometimes, he would glance up shyly, and then dart his gaze away. But Sophie understood. Trust was not given quickly, especially from a boy who had been taught by life that the world could be too much, too fast. So she stayed. She colored absurd pictures, lopsided dogs, flying turtles, trees shaped like candy canes. She read books aloud, even if Caleb didn't seem to listen, her voice weaving gentle stories into the air. When he flinched at a sudden sound outside, or tensed at a new movement, she would pause, give him space, and softly remind him, "If you feel scared, you can hug me, or not. It's always your choice." She never reached first, she never rushed, and slowly, something remarkable began to happen. One cloudy afternoon, as rain pattered against the sunroom glass, Caleb dropped his crayon, a bright green one, and walked across the rug, stepping into Sophie's open arms without a word. He rested his head against her shoulder, small and trembling, and let out a breath so deep it seemed to carry years of tension with it. Sophie didn't say anything. She just held him, steady and calm, letting him decide when he was ready to let go. Later that evening, Ethan Wallace stood by the doorway, unnoticed, watching the quiet scene unfold. It was not dramatic. There were no grand declarations, no tears, just a small boy finally daring to seek comfort and finding it. In the weeks that followed, the changes grew. Caleb began to sit closer to Sophie, sometimes leaning into her side as she read a story about brave turtles and shy foxes. He would reach out to hand her crayons, his fingers brushing hers without recoiling. He giggled an honest, unguarded sound when she drew a bear with 2 left feet. At first, Ethan told himself it was coincidence, a good day, a lucky moment. But as the visits continued, he saw the undeniable truth. Caleb was changing. Not overnight, not in ways that could be measured on a chart or captured in a clinical report, but in ways that mattered most. The boy who once flinched at every sound now hummed softly as he colored. The boy who once shrank from touch now leaned into gentle hugs. The boy who once stared at the ground now lifted his eyes briefly, but steadily to meet Sophie's gaze. And with each small victory, a piece of Ethan's tightly wound heart loosened. He found himself lingering in doorways more often, pretending to read emails on his phone while stealing glances at the sunlit room. He noticed the way Caleb's hands, once clenched in constant anxiety, now rested open in his lap. He noticed the way the boy's breathing stayed steady, even when a door creaked or a branch tapped the window. Ethan had spent his life mastering control. He had built empires, negotiated mergers, conquered markets. But watching Sophie teach him, not with lectures, but with presence, taught Ethan something he had never truly understood. Healing does not happen through force. It happens through patience. It happens when someone shows up again and again, offering a steady hand and an open heart without demanding anything in return. One evening, after Sophie had gone, Ethan found a crayon drawing left behind on the sunroom floor. It was a picture of a crooked house with smoke curling from the chimney and a bright sun overhead. And standing in front of the house were 3 stick figures, a tall one, a small one, and one with long hair and a big smile. Ethan stared at the drawing for a long time, the edges of the paper soft under his fingers. He didn't need Caleb to explain. He understood. This house, their house, wasn't just a fortress anymore. It wasn't a place of silence and shadows. It was becoming a home. And Sophie Bennett, with her patience, her gentleness, her unwavering belief in a little boy who had once been too afraid to reach out, had helped make it so. In the quiet that followed, Ethan sat back in the worn armchair by the window, cradling the drawing in his hands. For the first time in a very long time, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they were building something that would last. Not an empire, not a legacy, but a life. Together. In the weeks that followed, Ethan Wallace found himself changing in ways he hadn't anticipated. The transformation wasn't immediate or dramatic. It came in small, almost imperceptible shifts, the way a river smooths stone with time and persistence. He began spending more time at home. His assistant noticed first, hesitantly rescheduling meetings and pushing back deadlines that once would have been sacrosanct. Ethan no longer felt the urgent pull to be everywhere, to oversee everything. The empire he had spent decades building suddenly seemed less important than the quiet moments unfolding under his own roof. Some evenings, he would stand in the hallway outside the sunroom, listening to Sophie's gentle voice, weaving stories in the air. Caleb's soft giggles, once so rare they felt like miracles, now floated regularly through the house. Ethan learned to recognize the sound of crayons scraping across paper, the subtle rhythm of safety being built, one small act at a time. He started leaving his office door open, an unspoken invitation. Sometimes Caleb would wander by, peeking inside with wide, curious eyes. Ethan would glance up from his laptop, offering a smile, no pressure, no expectations. Slowly, Caleb began to step inside, perching quietly in the corner with a coloring book or simply watching his father work. Ethan also noticed changes in himself. His temper, once quick to flare under stress, cooled. He found patience he hadn't known he possessed. Delays, mistakes, interruptions, things that would have once sparked frustration now earned a deep breath and a measured response. One evening, after Sophie had finished her visit and Caleb had gone to bed, Ethan found himself lingering in the sunroom. He sat on the floor, legs stretched out, studying the colorful drawings taped along the windows, a vibrant testament to Caleb's expanding world. In one picture, 3 stick figures stood hand in hand beneath a bright yellow sun. Ethan recognized himself, tall and square-shouldered, Caleb with his mop of curls, and Sophie, her hair drawn in wild looping lines. Above them, Caleb had scrawled a single word in shaky letters: family. The sight of it hit Ethan harder than any business deal, any accolade, any worldly success he had ever achieved. Family. Not an obligation, not a duty, a choice. A gift. The realization unsettled him, not because it was unwelcome, but because it was unfamiliar. Love, he realized, wasn't something you earned through achievement or commanded through authority. It was something you nurtured, tended to, and trusted to grow in its own time. Inspired by Sophie's example, Ethan began making small changes. He started reading to Caleb before bed, choosing stories with silly voices and exaggerated expressions that made his son giggle uncontrollably. He learned to leave space for silence, to sit quietly beside Caleb without filling the air with questions or instructions. On weekends, he and Caleb took slow walks around the garden. At first, they simply wandered, Caleb clutching a favorite stuffed animal. Gradually, Caleb began pointing out flowers, birds, and interesting rocks. Ethan listened, amazed at the details his son noticed, things he himself had overlooked in his busy, rushed life. Sophie continued her visits, each one a gentle reinforcement of the bridge they were building. She never made grand gestures or set lofty goals. Her magic was in her consistency, her quiet presence, her unwavering belief that Caleb was enough exactly as he was. One afternoon, after a particularly joyful session of storytelling and crayon masterpieces, Ethan caught Sophie by the front door. "I don't think I ever properly thanked you," he said, his voice rough with emotion he barely understood. Sophie smiled, adjusting the tote bag on her shoulder. "You don't have to," she said simply. But Ethan shook his head. "You changed more than just his life," he said. "You changed mine too." Sophie's eyes softened, and for a moment they stood there in the golden afternoon light, two people who understood that sometimes the greatest transformations come not from force or strategy, but from kindness, patience, and the willingness to simply show up. As Sophie drove away, Ethan watched her car disappear down the long driveway. He turned back toward his house, now filled with laughter and crayon drawings, with the scent of storybooks and the warmth of second chances. He wasn't just building a relationship with Caleb. He was rebuilding himself. And for the first time in as long as he could remember, Ethan Wallace no longer measured his worth by the size of his empire or the weight of his portfolio. He measured it by the strength of the little hand that now reached for his without fear. By the smile that bloomed when he entered the room. By the simple, priceless gift of being called Dad without hesitation. And that, he realized, was a legacy worth more than all the fortunes in the world. It happened on a Tuesday morning, without warning, like a sudden crack in a window pane you hadn't noticed until it splintered across the entire surface. The photo surfaced first, grainy image taken from outside the diner through the glare of a dusty window. In the photo, Caleb Wallace, small and vulnerable, clung tightly to Sophie Bennett's waist, his face buried against her sweater. Standing just a few feet away was Ethan Wallace, caught mid-stride, a look of startled confusion on his face. The caption under the image screamed louder than the picture itself. "Billionaire's son clings to unknown waitress morning cuddle," or something more. By noon, the photo had spread across local blogs, social media feeds, and even slipped onto a national gossip site. The story twisted quickly, as stories often do. Speculation fueled the fire. Who was the mysterious woman? Why was she with the boy? Was she a new nanny? A scandalous affair? People who knew nothing about Caleb's challenges, nothing about the fragile trust that had been so painstakingly built, began to pick apart a moment that was never meant for their eyes. Ethan saw the image while leaving a lunch meeting. His assistant, visibly pale, rushed toward him with her phone outstretched. "You'll want to handle this before it spirals," she said, her voice tight. Ethan stared at the screen, the thumbnail mocking him. Caleb, Sophie, caught in the most tender, most private of moments, now plastered across the internet like cheap gossip. He felt the burn rise in his chest, not just anger, but betrayal. Within an hour, Ethan's legal team mobilized. They fired off cease and desist letters, contacted media outlets, and arranged for the photo to be scrubbed from major platforms. His PR consultant labeled it unfortunate but manageable. But Ethan wasn't thinking about optics or damage control. He was thinking about trust. He was thinking about Caleb. How had this happened? His mind raced with possibilities, each one darker than the last. Had Sophie sold the story? Had she allowed this exposure, this violation, for attention or money? The thought of Caleb's trust being betrayed, of that precious, delicate bridge being shattered, made Ethan's hands tremble with fury. He didn't call Sophie, he didn't ask for her side, he didn't ask at all. Instead, he picked up the phone, called Maggie's diner, and asked to speak to the manager. "Tell Sophie Bennett the arrangement is over," he said, his voice like ice. "No further visits. No contact. No explanation needed." The message was delivered during Sophie's mid-morning break. She stood by the prep counter, the folded piece of paper in her hand, her heart sinking. She didn't cry. She didn't rush to call Ethan. She didn't run to the estate, demanding to be heard. Instead, she sat down at the corner booth, the booth where Caleb had first looked up at her, where their fragile bond had first begun, and unfolded the small crayon drawing Caleb had once given her. Two stick figures, arms wide, a red heart hovering between them. Her fingers traced the smudged crayon lines, her throat tightening. She understood, perhaps too well. Sometimes, no matter how much trust you build, fear can knock it down in a single blow. Sophie pulled a blank sheet of paper from her tote bag, folded it twice, and began to write. No greeting, no pleading. Just a single sentence in her soft, looping handwriting. Not everyone needs words. Sometimes all it takes is someone calm enough to offer their hand. She slipped the note into a plain envelope, unadorned, unperfumed, unassuming. After her shift, Sophie drove to the Wallace estate one last time. She didn't buzz the intercom. She didn't wait for anyone to come out. She simply placed the envelope carefully into the mailbox, pausing for a moment to press her fingers lightly against it, a silent goodbye, before turning away. As she walked back to her car, the Santa Fe sky blushed gold with the approaching sunset. In that brief, breathtaking hush, Sophie felt no anger, just sorrow. Some things, she knew, weren't meant to be argued. Some silences carried more meaning than 1,000 explanations ever could. Back inside the grand house, Caleb sat by the window, cradling a stuffed turtle Sophie had once given him. He didn't understand why she had stopped coming. He only knew that the sunroom felt emptier now, the colors duller, the air heavier. He missed her. In the days that followed, Ethan buried himself in work, refusing to think about the hollow ache that had settled in his chest. He told himself he had done the right thing, that he had protected his son. But at night, when the house grew too quiet and the shadows grew too long, Ethan found himself staring at the crayon drawings still taped to the sunroom walls. And he wondered, had he been wrong? Had he let fear, his old, stubborn companion, speak louder than truth? Sophie Bennett sat quietly in the corner booth of Maggie's diner, her fingers tracing the rim of a chipped coffee cup. The breakfast crowd buzzed around her, plates clattered, and cheerful chatter floated through the air. But she felt removed from it all like a spectator in a world she no longer belonged to. The envelope she had left at Ethan Wallace's estate remained unacknowledged. Days had passed, and with each silent sunrise, Sophie understood more clearly. There would be no call, no explanation, no apology. It wasn't anger that filled her. It was sorrow, deep, quiet sorrow. She didn't blame Ethan, not entirely. Fear had a way of clouding even the clearest judgment, but the wound still ached. a hollow space where hope had once lived. After her shift, Sophie found herself driving without a destination. The wide, sun-drenched streets of Santa Fe blurred past her windows. She ended up at a small park tucked behind the old library, a place she'd often visited during her nursing school days, when life had felt simpler and dreams had seemed closer. Sitting on a worn wooden bench, she pulled out the crayon drawing Caleb had given her, the two stick figures with the bright red heart between them. The paper was creased now, edges soft from being unfolded and refolded too many times. Sophie smiled sadly. "Not everyone needs words," she whispered, repeating the line she'd written in her farewell note. "Sometimes all it takes is someone calm enough to offer their hand." She wondered if Caleb missed her, wondered if he sat by the sunroom window, waiting. The thought tightened her chest, but she pushed it aside gently. Attachment, she knew, was a gift and a burden. Her presence had been a bridge for Caleb, but it was never meant to be a crutch. Some connections, no matter how strong, were only meant to last for a season. Meanwhile, back at the Wallace estate, the atmosphere had shifted. The house felt heavier, the silence deeper. Caleb had retreated again, withdrawing into himself like a flower folding away from the cold. Ethan noticed. Of course, he noticed. He saw the way Caleb no longer hummed softly while coloring. Saw how the boy's crayons remained untouched in their tin. Saw how his son lingered by the window, watching the driveway with a quiet, heartbreaking hope. At night, Ethan would find Caleb curled up in bed, hugging a worn pillow tightly to his chest. "This one's not warm," Caleb had whispered once, not knowing his father stood in the doorway, heartbreaking. Ethan told himself he had done the right thing, protecting his son from betrayal, from hurt. But in the stillness of the night, with only his own thoughts for company, doubts crept in. Had he been too quick to judge? Had he let fear, his old, familiar companion, drive away the very person who had taught his son how to trust, how to hope, how to love? Across town, Sophie continued living her quiet life. She picked up extra shifts at the diner, volunteered at the community center when she could, and tried to let go of the ache that clung to her ribs. She didn't seek out news about the Wallace family. She didn't drive by the estate. She simply carried the memory of Caleb's tentative hugs, his shy smiles, the way his small hand had once reached for her, carried it, like a fragile, precious thing she had been entrusted with for a brief, shining moment. Life moved on. But some part of Sophie remained tucked away in that sunroom, in the scent of crayons and the hush of whispered stories. One evening, as she closed up the diner, a little girl with a crooked ponytail and mismatched socks wandered in, clutching a battered book to her chest. Her mother, flustered and apologetic, explained that her daughter had insisted on finding the lady who reads stories. Sophie knelt down, meeting the girl's wide, hopeful eyes. "Would you like to hear a story?" she asked. The girl nodded eagerly. So, right there, on the worn linoleum floor, surrounded by the scent of coffee and pie crust, Sophie opened the book and began to read. Her voice, soft and steady, wove magic into the air once more, and though her heart still carried the bruise of goodbye, Sophie realized something important. The gift she'd given Caleb wasn't something that could be taken away by fear or misunderstanding. It was real. It mattered, and it would ripple outward, one child, one story, one act of quiet love at a time. Sophie Bennett hadn't stopped offering her hand. She simply learned that sometimes the ones who need it most aren't always the ones you expect. And so, under the soft hum of diner lights and the patient ticking of the old wall clock, Sophie continued to do what she did best: show up. Quietly. Faithfully. With open arms. It was nearly a week after Sophie Bennett had quietly slipped from their lives that the truth finally surfaced. Ethan Wallace sat at his desk, a mug of untouched coffee cooling beside his elbow, staring blankly at the crayon drawings still taped to the sunroom walls. The house was too quiet. Caleb's laughter had faded into memory, replaced by long silences and restless nights. He should have felt relief. The scandal had died down. The photo had been scrubbed from major sites. His reputation remained intact, yet the victory tasted bitter on his tongue. It was Ethan's chief of security, Mr. Delaney, who finally broke the silence. "Sir," Delaney said, stepping into the office with a thick folder in hand, "we finished the investigation regarding the photograph." Ethan's heart thudded in his chest. He gestured for the man to continue. "It wasn't an insider leak," Delaney said carefully. "It wasn't Ms. Bennett, either." Ethan frowned, sitting up straighter. "A customer," Delaney continued. "Someone passing through town, visiting family. They were at the diner that morning, sitting by the window, snapped the photo on their phone without much thought, posted it to their personal social media account." He slid the folder across the desk. Inside were screenshots, timestamps, and a casual caption that read, "Cutest thing I've seen today." No malice, no scandal, just a moment, captured carelessly, shared without understanding. Ethan's fingers tightened on the edge of the folder. A wave of shame and regret crashed over him, stronger than anything he'd felt in years. Sophie had not betrayed them. She had protected Caleb in ways no one else ever had. And Hein, his fear, his pride, had driven her away without giving her the chance to explain. The weight of it pressed down on him, suffocating. He rose from his desk and made his way to the sunroom, the walls still bright with Caleb's colorful creations. He knelt by the low bookshelf, pulling out the worn tote bag Sophie had once left behind after a particularly long afternoon of drawing and stories. Inside, tucked between picture books and half-used coloring pads, was a folded piece of paper, the note Sophie had left. "Not everyone needs words. Sometimes all it takes is someone calm enough to offer their hand." Ethan pressed the note to his chest, his throat tightening. How could he have been so blind? He thought of Caleb's tentative smiles, his small hands reaching out, his trust so delicately given. And he thought of Sophie, who had never demanded, never pushed, never asked for anything in return. He had failed them both. Down the hall, Caleb sat by the window, clutching the stuffed turtle Sophie had once brought him. His small body was tense, his eyes distant. The boy hadn't asked for Sophie by name, he hadn't cried or thrown tantrums. But the loss of her presence had etched itself into every line of his small frame. Ethan moved to the doorway, leaning heavily against the frame. "Caleb," he said, voice low. The boy turned slightly, acknowledging him with a weary glance. "Would you like to go somewhere tomorrow?" Ethan asked. "Someplace special?" Caleb hesitated, then gave the smallest nod. That night, Ethan sat at the dining room table long after Caleb had gone to bed, staring at the empty space across from him. His mind churned with memories of Sophie's gentle patience, her unwavering kindness. He thought about pride, how it had built his fortune, but perhaps also how it had cost him things far more valuable. And he made a decision. No more pride, no more fear. Tomorrow, he would find Sophie Bennett. Tomorrow, he would try to fix what he had broken, not with money, not with grand gestures, but with something far harder for a man like him to offer: humility and hope. As the first light of dawn crept over Santa Fe, painting the sky in delicate hues of gold and pink, Ethan Wallace felt something shift inside him, a fragile but determined resolve. He had been wrong. Terribly, unforgivably wrong. But maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to set it right. In the days that followed Sophie's departure, the Wallace estate grew heavier with an aching kind of silence. Caleb Wallace, once a small but growing spark of light, had retreated into himself again. It wasn't loud, it wasn't immediate. But the shift was undeniable. Gone were the colourful drawings taped proudly along the sunroom windows. The crayons lay untouched in their tin, the picture books stacked neatly but unopened. Caleb no longer hummed softly as he coloured, no longer padded into the kitchen with sleepy curiosity to find his father. He waited. At first, Ethan Wallace didn't fully recognise the signs. He thought Caleb was simply tired, maybe overwhelmed by all the recent changes. But then, late one night, Ethan passed by Caleb's bedroom and noticed the soft flicker of the nightlight spilling into the hallway. He knocked gently and pushed the door open. Caleb lay curled up on his bed, hugging a pillow tightly to his small chest. His eyes were open, but distant, heavy with a sadness too big for someone so small. Ethan approached slowly, lowering himself to sit on the edge of the bed. "Can't sleep, buddy?" he asked, voice low and careful. Caleb didn't look up. He pressed his cheek deeper into the pillow. "This one's not warm," he whispered. "Not like her." The words hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. Not warm like her. He reached out, gently smoothing Caleb's hair back from his forehead. "I'm sorry," Ethan said, barely able to get the words out. "I'm so sorry." Caleb didn't respond. He simply closed his eyes and clung tighter to the pillow, as if trying to will it into becoming the comfort he had lost. In the following days, Ethan tried everything he could think of. He read stories at bedtime, doing his best to mimic Sophie's animated voices. Caleb listened, polite and quiet, but his laughter, that sweet, bubbling sound, never came. Ethan set up art projects in the sunroom, scattering fresh paper and new boxes of crayons. Caleb would glance at them, but he never sat down. He even tried baking cookies, remembering how Sophie once mentioned the smell of warm sugar always made children feel safe. The kitchen filled with the scent of vanilla and chocolate, but Caleb remained curled up in the living room, silent. Presence alone, Ethan realized, was not enough. Because Sophie hadn't just been present, she had been a lighthouse, steady, gentle, patient, guiding Caleb safely through a world that too often felt overwhelming. And now, without that beacon, Caleb was adrift again. Each night, Ethan watched his son grow quieter, smaller, dimmer. He would find Caleb standing at the sunroom window, peering out into the darkness, waiting for a car that wouldn't come, for a figure that wouldn't appear. It broke Ethan in ways he hadn't thought possible. He had spent his life believing he could protect Caleb with walls and wealth, with security teams and private therapists. But none of it, not the fortune, not the fortress he had built, could replace the simple, irreplaceable gift Sophie had given: trust. Love, safety. One evening, well past midnight, Ethan found Caleb curled up on the couch, clutching the stuffed turtle Sophie had once given him. His small face was damp with silent tears. Ethan knelt beside him, gathering the boy into his arms. Caleb didn't resist. He didn't pull away. He simply sagged against his father's chest, too tired to fight the sadness any longer. Ethan held him tightly, whispering promises he prayed he could keep. "I'm going to fix this," he murmured into Caleb's hair. "I don't know how yet, but I will. I promise." The weight of his failure pressed heavily against him, but beneath it, a fragile hope flickered. It wasn't too late. He had let fear drive him once. He wouldn't make the same mistake again. As Caleb drifted into an exhausted sleep, still nestled in his father's arms, Ethan stared out the window at the endless night. Tomorrow, he would start. Tomorrow, he would find Sophie Bennett. And somehow, some way, he would bring her and the light she carried back into their lives. Not as a favor, not as a transaction, but because he finally understood. Love, the real kind, wasn't something you earned. It was something you fought for, something you cherished, something you never, ever let slip away without trying to hold on to it with everything you had. The next morning, Ethan Wallace woke before the sun, a restless energy propelling him from bed. The decision had crystallized in him overnight, as sure and steady as the sunrise. Today, he would find Sophie Bennett, not his assistant, not his lawyers, not a carefully crafted letter from his office. Himself. He brewed coffee he didn't drink, pulled on jeans and a sweater clothes far less polished than his usual armor, and slipped out the front door before Caleb even stirred. The air was crisp with the early chill of morning. As he drove through the waking streets of Santa Fe, Ethan realized how little he knew about where to start. Sophie had left no forwarding address, no number, no formal goodbye. But he knew her heart, and he knew where hearts like hers tended to go. He tried Maggie's diner first, heart hammering as he pushed open the familiar door. The smell of coffee and frying bacon wrapped around him, and for a moment he almost turned back, afraid. But then he saw her. Sophie stood behind the counter, wiping it down with slow, steady strokes. She looked tired, but peaceful, her hair tucked behind one ear, her face softer than he remembered, not weighed down by regret, but by resilience. Ethan crossed the room, every step heavier than the last. When she finally looked up and saw him, there was a flicker of surprise in her eyes, quickly masked by something quieter guarded kindness. "Mr. Wallace," she said politely, folding her towel neatly. He winced at the formality. "Sophie," he said, voice rougher than he intended. "Please, can we talk?" She hesitated, glancing around the nearly empty diner. After a moment, she nodded and motioned toward a booth in the back corner. They sat opposite each other, a universe of pain and misunderstanding stretched across the small table. Ethan took a shaky breath. "I'm sorry," he said simply. Sophie's hands stilled on the table. "I believed something I shouldn't have," Ethan continued, his voice low. "I let fear speak louder than truth. I didn't ask. I didn't trust you." He paused, searching her face for any sign that she might hear him. "You showed up for Caleb when no one else could reach him. You taught him. You taught me that love isn't about control or protection. It's about presence. About patience." Sophie's eyes shimmered, but she blinked the emotion away. "I'm the richest father I know," Ethan said, with a wry, broken laugh. "But I wasn't rich enough to teach my son how to hug someone, or how to let someone hug him back." Sophie let out a soft breath, and for the first time, Ethan saw her walls begin to lower. "I never wanted anything from you," she said quietly. "I just wanted him to know he was safe." "I know," Ethan said. "I know that now." They sat in silence, the diner humming softly around them. Finally, Ethan reached into his jacket and pulled out a small piece of paper, the crayon drawing Caleb had made, now carefully laminated to preserve its fragile lines. "He never stopped waiting for you," Ethan said, sliding the drawing across the table. "Neither did I." Sophie picked up the drawing with trembling fingers, her thumb brushing over the stick figures and the red heart. Tears filled her eyes, but she smiled through them. He's okay?" she asked, voice cracking. Ethan shook his head. "He's not," he admitted. "Not without you." Sophie's hand went to her mouth, stifling a sob. "Please," Ethan said, leaning forward, urgency in his tone. "I'm not asking you to fix him. I'm asking you to be part of his world again, however you choose, however you feel right." For a long moment, Sophie said nothing. Then slowly, she nodded. "I'll come," she said, her voice steady, despite the tears. Relief washed over Ethan so powerfully that he had to grip the edge of the table to stay grounded. They stood together, an unspoken agreement hanging between them, fragile but real. As they walked toward the door, Ethan turned to her once more. "Thank you," he said, meaning it with a depth he hadn't known he possessed. Sophie smiled small, genuine, forgiving. "You're welcome," she said. "But it's not about you, Ethan." She glanced out the window where the morning sun had begun to rise higher over the hills. "It's about Caleb." And in that moment, Ethan Wallace understood completely. This wasn't a redemption story for him. It was a love story for his son. And Sophie Bennett had always been one of its brightest chapters. Together, they stepped into the sunlight toward healing, toward forgiveness, toward a future worth fighting for. The next afternoon, Ethan Wallace parked his car at the community library, Caleb's small hand wrapped tightly in his own. Caleb hadn't said much during the drive, only clutched his stuffed turtle and stared out the window, but Ethan could feel the shift in him, a nervous hopefulness vibrating beneath his quiet exterior. Inside the library, tucked away in the children's reading corner, Sophie Bennett sat cross-legged on a brightly colored rug, a worn copy of Harold and the Purple Crayon in her hands. A small group of children gathered around her, their faces lit with rapt attention as she brought the story to life with her gentle voice and animated expressions. Ethan hesitated by the entrance, heart pounding, but Caleb tugged lightly at his sleeve. "There," Caleb whispered, pointing. Ethan smiled and squeezed his son's hand before leading him closer. When Sophie's eyes met Caleb's, something unspoken passed between them. She set the book aside, her smile blooming warm and wide. "Hi, Caleb," she said, voice soft enough to make the moment feel private despite the crowd. Caleb let go of his father's hand and crossed the room slowly. For a heartbeat, he paused, uncertain. Sophie didn't rush him. She simply opened her arms. An invitation, not a demand. And Caleb, without hesitation, walked straight into them. The room seemed to hold its breath. Ethan felt his throat tighten painfully as he watched his son fold into Sophie's embrace, his small body relaxing as if he had finally come home. Sophie rested her cheek lightly against Caleb's curls, holding him just firmly enough to anchor him, just gently enough to let him know he was free to choose. When Caleb finally pulled back, he didn't retreat. Instead, he sat beside her on the rug, picking up a crayon from a nearby basket and beginning to draw. Ethan lowered himself into a nearby chair, letting out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The rebuilding had begun. In the weeks that followed, Sophie visited the Wallace estate regularly, but this time it wasn't as a nanny or a therapist. There were no contracts, no paychecks, no expectations. She came because Caleb and Ethan needed her. And because she cared. Their time together wasn't structured. Some days, they built elaborate towers from wooden blocks, only to knock them down with peals of laughter. Other days, they sat in the sunroom, quietly coloring side by side, the silence between them comfortable and easy. Slowly, the walls that fear had built around Caleb began to crumble. He started humming again as he colored, sometimes even singing snatches of songs Sophie taught him. He reached for her hand when the world felt too loud. He curled against her side during story time, trusting her presence to shield him from the chaos outside. And Ethan, always nearby, learned too. He learned that love wasn't something you commanded. It was something you offered freely, patiently, day after day. He learned to sit with Caleb in silence, to wait for him to reach out instead of pushing him to perform. He learned to celebrate small victories, a shared smile, a gentle touch, a whispered "love you" that Caleb mumbled one night before bed. One evening, after a long afternoon of drawing and storytelling, Sophie found Ethan lingering by the sunroom doorway. "Stay," Caleb said suddenly, looking up from his drawing. Sophie smiled, touched by the simple invitation. Ethan cleared his throat. "Would you like to stay for dinner?" he asked, his voice surprisingly shy. Sophie hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "I'd love to," she said. That night, around the dinner table, laughter rang through the Wallace home for the first time in what felt like forever. Caleb told Sophie about his dreams about building a rocket ship, about teaching his stuffed turtle how to fly. Sophie listened intently, asking questions that made Caleb's eyes sparkle. Ethan watched them, a lump forming in his throat. This was what he had been missing all along. Not control, not perfection. Connection, love, presence. After dinner, as Caleb dozed off in the living room, his head resting against Sophie's shoulder, Ethan found himself speaking words he hadn't planned. "You changed everything," he said quietly. Sophie looked at him, her eyes soft. "No," she corrected gently. "Caleb changed everything. I just gave him the space to do it." Ethan nodded, swallowing the thick emotion rising in his chest. "And you gave me the space to change too," he said. Sophie smiled, brushing a strand of hair from Caleb's forehead. "Sometimes," she said, "all it takes is one open door." Ethan knew then that they were building something real. Not just healing old wounds, not just patching broken trust, but creating a new future one filled with love, patience, and the kind of strength that only comes from having once been broken. As he sat there, the quiet hum of the evening wrapping around them, Ethan Wallace felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope, steady, enduring, real. And for the first time in a long, long while, he truly believed they were going to be okay. Months after Sophie Bennett re-entered their lives, a new energy filled the Wallace household, one of hope, of purpose. The transformation in Caleb was undeniable. But Ethan Wallace found himself changing just as profoundly. One crisp afternoon, as Sophie and Caleb colored by the sunroom window, Ethan sat nearby, a notebook open in his lap. He had been thinking for weeks now, scribbling ideas, crossing them out, writing again. Watching Sophie work her quiet magic with Caleb, he felt a certainty settle into his bones. He needed to do more. Not just for Caleb, but for all the children like him, the ones whose needs weren't met by traditional therapies, whose trust had been bruised by a world that moved too fast and demanded too much. That evening, after Caleb had gone to bed, Ethan sat across from Sophie at the kitchen table. "I've been thinking," he began, tapping his pen against the notebook, "about starting something of foundation." Sophie looked up, curiosity flickering in her eyes. "Not a therapy center," Ethan clarified quickly. "Not a clinic. Something gentler. A program where kids like Caleb can experience safe, intentional connection, where they're not analyzed or diagnosed. Just seen." Sophie's expression softened. "What would you call it?" she asked. Ethan glanced down at the crayon drawing Caleb had given him that morning, two stick figures, arms wide open, a red heart between them. He smiled. "The first hug," he said. Sophie blinked back sudden tears, her hand pressing over her heart. "That's perfect," she whispered. They spent the next few weeks planning. Sophie brought her experience with children, her gentle wisdom about emotional safety. Ethan brought his organizational skills, his business acumen, and for the first time, a deep understanding that the most important investments weren't financial. They rented a sunny space at the local community center, filled it with soft rugs, baskets of crayons, picture books, stuffed animals, and musical instruments. Volunteers were trained not in behavior management, but in presence, how to simply be there, open and patient, without expectation. At the launch event, families trickled in, hesitant at first. Children clung to their parents' legs, overwhelmed by the newness of it all. But slowly, laughter began to fill the air. In one corner, a toddler built a tower of foam blocks, knocking it over with shrieks of delight. Across the room, a shy little girl sat cross-legged beside a volunteer, humming as she colored. And in the center of it all, Caleb Wallace stood clutching Sophie's hand, his face beaming. When Sophie knelt beside him and held out her arms, Caleb didn't hesitate. He stepped forward and hugged her tightly, not out of fear, not out of desperation, but out of pure, joyful trust. The crowd fell silent, watching the quiet miracle unfold. Then, in a move that made Ethan's throat tighten with emotion, Caleb turned toward his father. He didn't rush. He didn't speak. He simply raised both arms, palms open, a silent invitation. Ethan dropped to one knee, gathering his son into his arms. No tension. No hesitation, just warmth, just love. A photographer captured the moment, and though Ethan usually hated being in the spotlight, he didn't mind this time. Because this was worth sharing. The story of the first hug spread quickly. Local newspapers ran features about the program. Word of mouth brought more families seeking a space where their children could simply be. Ethan and Sophie expanded the initiative carefully, opening additional sessions and training more volunteers. They kept the heart of it simple. No fixing, no forcing. Just offering safe arms, warm smiles, and unconditional presence. Caleb continued to thrive, but what amazed Ethan most was seeing the ripple effect beyond his son. Children who had once shrunk from touch began reaching out. Parents who had grown weary from years of trying to fix their children, found a place to breathe, to hope, to believe again. One evening, as they locked up the center after a long, joy-filled day, Ethan turned to Sophie. "You know," he said, his voice thick with gratitude, "when I first met you, I thought I was building a legacy with contracts and companies." Sophie smiled, slipping her arm through his. "Turns out," she said, "the best legacies are built one hug at a time." Ethan nodded, pulling her into a gentle embrace. And there, under the soft glow of the streetlights, surrounded by laughter echoing in the night air, Ethan Wallace realized he had finally found what he had been searching for all along. Not success, not control, but connection, and a future filled with first hugs and countless more to come. Years later, the first hug had blossomed into something greater than Ethan Wallace or Sophie Bennett could have ever imagined. What began as a single room filled with soft rugs and crayons had grown into a network of centers across the state, each a safe haven for children who needed not fixing, but presence. Every hug shared within those walls, every tear wiped away, every small hand held in patience, became a testament to what love without expectation could accomplish. But for Ethan, the greatest legacy remained at home. Caleb Wallace, now a teenager, still carried the heart of that first fragile hug within him. He had grown into a kind, thoughtful young man, still sensitive, still deliberate, but no longer ruled by fear. He volunteered at the first hug centers on weekends, crouching down to meet the smallest children eye to eye, offering them the same steady comfort he had once so desperately needed. One golden afternoon, Ethan found himself standing on the porch of the original community center where it all began. He watched as Caleb helped a little boy who had been clinging nervously to a corner. Caleb didn't pressure him. He didn't lecture or coax. He simply sat nearby, humming softly, coloring without expectation. And slowly, just as Caleb once had, the little boy edged closer. Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat, pride, gratitude, wonder all, tangled together. Sophie joined him on the porch, a cup of coffee in each hand. She passed one to Ethan with a smile. "You should be proud," she said quietly. Ethan shook his head, eyes still on Caleb. "I'm grateful," he corrected. "Proud implies I had something to do with it." Sophie laughed softly. "You had everything to do with it." He turned to her, truly seeing her the woman who had taught him the most important lessons of his life, not through grand speeches or lectures, but through steady presence, unwavering kindness, and an endless supply of hope. "We all did," Ethan said, voice thick. That evening, a small ceremony was held at the center's courtyard to celebrate the organization's 10th anniversary. Families, volunteers, and children who had grown up wrapped in the gentle arms of the first hug gathered under strings of warm lights. Caleb, standing taller than Ethan now, gave a short speech. He spoke about fear, how it can isolate and shrink the world, and about connection, how a simple hug could shatter those walls. "Sometimes," Caleb said, his voice steady and strong, "all it takes is one person willing to stay." Ethan wiped at his eyes, unashamed of the emotion that filled him. After the speeches, music floated through the night and laughter echoed across the courtyard. Children ran barefoot across the grass, chasing fireflies, while parents and volunteers shared quiet conversations filled with memory and hope. Ethan wandered to the edge of the gathering, letting the joyful chaos wash over him. He looked up at the stars, the same stars he had once stared at, alone, from his vast, empty estate, wondering if there was more to life than deals and deadlines. Now, he knew the answer. Love. Presence, connection. Those were the true currencies of life. Sophie found him there, as she always seemed to, steady, constant, a soft light in a sometimes dark world. "Thank you," he said, his voice a rough whisper. Sophie smiled, slipping her hand into his. "For what?" she teased gently. Ethan squeezed her hand. "For teaching me," he said. "For staying." They stood together in the cool night air, watching their shared dream unfold around them. Later, as the crowd thinned and the lanterns flickered low, Caleb approached them, holding a small wooden plaque. It was simpler, hand-carved heart, cradled between two open hands with the words, "The first hug where healing begins." "I thought we could hang it in the new center," Caleb said, a little shyly. Ethan took the plaque with reverent hands, tracing the grain of the wood with his thumb. "It's perfect," he said. As they walked back toward the center together, Ethan marveled at the journey that had brought them here, a journey that had begun not with a grand plan, but with a single, tentative hug between a frightened little boy and a woman who refused to give up on him. In the end, it hadn't been about fixing or saving or transforming. It had been about presence, about believing in the quiet, unseen miracles that happen when you simply show up day after day, heart open, arms wide. And as the stars wheeled overhead, Ethan Wallace understood, truly, deeply understood, that this was the legacy he would leave behind. A legacy built not on power or wealth, but on love freely given, on first hugs, and on the unshakable belief that every child, every heart deserves to be held, seen, and loved. Sometimes the greatest changes in life don't come from grand gestures, but from the quiet persistence of love. Ethan Wallace's journey reminds us that presence, patience, and simple acts of kindness often heal wounds that money or ambition never could. It's not about fixing others, but about showing up day after day with open arms and a willing heart. In a world that often moves too fast, where achievements are measured by wealth and status, stories like Ethan's and Caleb's teach us what truly matters: connection, trust, and the courage to be gentle. The first hug wasn't just a program, it became a testament to the idea that every soul, no matter how small or wounded, deserves a safe space to grow. In our own lives, perhaps the most lasting legacy we can leave behind isn't built with bricks or gold, but with the quiet certainty that we made someone feel seen, valued, and loved. Because sometimes one open hug can change everything.